Thanks, Audrey, and great to see you all. I'd also just like to acknowledge that we're in the lands of the Eastern Kulin Nation, stolen and not ceded. Just to thank the RUPC, Scott and Nikos, for this really interesting project, which gave me a job for a little while when I finished the PhD, and I guess got me to revisit a whole lot of work which I'd done in kind of media policy and governance, but had sort of gone by the wayside as I went off into going back to do a PhD to get away from doing that, and then to go into kind of thinking about the art school, which is where I've done most of my teaching and kind of work. And I guess what was interesting about the RUPC for me is that it's one of the very few places where these sort of two parts of my mongrel background actually can come together in some way. And there aren't many places like it, so thanks for that. Thanks, Danielle, for coordinating the event. I wasn't really given a brief for this presentation, so in classic RUPC style, it's quite open. So I should have kind of, I guess, reported on a lot of the very interesting work which has happened over the course of the project during the time I've been involved with it, but instead I thought I'll use the opportunity to think about some new work and present something of that. It's pretty undercooked at the moment. Like, it really only does feel like it's just sketching out a line that I've been thinking through for a long time but haven't really articulated before today in this particular way. So so bear with me with that, but I hope that also provides some space for you to give some input, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion in order to kind of think this question through a bit more rigorously. And this also, I guess, comes out a little bit of some work with the Berlin-based critic Rachel O'Reilly on artistic infrastructure that we've been kind of talking through, I guess since the BNO Sydney boycott. So I'm going to do some reading because there's a sort of theoretical component, and whenever I'm trying to track through thinking, I need to write it down, because if I talk casually about it, I probably won't be saying it the right way, especially because it's new. So but we'll try and pull out some of those things. So the question of how network publics have changed art, think about the kind of the sociometric as a kind of sociologic, and so for presenting institutions of art, the tangibility and specificity of information brought about by new technologies have allowed new kinds of measurement and fundamentally changed the nature of audiences. Audience development is now a key strategy and a performance indicator which has to be managed. Far from simply a traditional blockbuster, today the cultural institution is required to specify and develop specific audiences. Various regimes of value are attached to funding and revenue streams, constitute the public, which is no longer really just a kind of a wealthy patron and an indiscriminate kind of public, but is actually specific, things like education initiatives, inclusion measures such as diversity, outreach programs, all sort of, I guess, falling under this sort of domain of what stakeholder development is where we're at. So this new mode of public management is not necessarily good or bad, but I think in Foucault's kind of terms, it's dangerous and remains to be understood, and also requires us, I think, to update our understanding of the relation between public and private in the experience of art, and between the historical European account of a universal or universalizable large P public sphere and the small P publics that are understood in Michael Warner's terms as a kind of public that comes into being as an audience, through an event. I think Scott gestured at that sort of twin set of public, the use of public and scales of those. So perhaps we can understand this sort of technological apparatus as forming a new kind of perhaps biopolitical relationship between these forms of public where an alternative audience no longer departs from the institutions of power but is actually managed and developed by it. So this multiplicitous and above all managed institutional public sphere also rests then on an explicitly sociological conception of the artwork's public. By sociological I don't mean just the academic discipline, but I mean like there's these new techniques of audience segmentation that have a logic that can be graphed as an indicator and sort of tracked on a dashboard. You can see your kind of engagement levels with different audiences kind of rising and falling. So when I did my master's research on class analysis, I spent far too much time with people like Sorensen and Eric Olin Wright and these kind of Marxists who were in the 1980s who were trying to kind of correlate different kind of class schema statistically with sort of various theoretical accounts. And I think, and they were kind of ahead of their time in a way. They were trying to retrofit bad statistics to explain, what was actually happening with kind of, class mobility in society. But today in the algorithmic event, we can say that the statistical indicator has an advance on the reality, and that it comes to, as sort of Stiegler would put it, it comes to produce the reality. So you have to develop this audience in advance of this audience appearing because you have an indicator for it in some way. So with that as a given, I think it's kind of curious to me that that Boris Groys, in the introduction to Going Public, launches a critique of what he terms the sociological mode of art criticism. When this sociological approach is being fully mobilized by administrators as the actual undergirding infrastructure for cultural institutions of art. So that's really the basis of what this thinking has come through. I've been trying to say, why is he so against sort of sociological kind of critique of art when it seems to me that we're in a time of a new kind of sociology brought about by the kind of technical system. So with this term infrastructure, I'm pointing to the underpinning material and immaterial underpinnings of production that Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr suggest only becomes visible upon breakdown. That's one of their 8 characteristics of infrastructure. You don't notice it until it breaks, and then suddenly, here's this infrastructure that I was relying on in some way. Angela Metropoulos provides my favorite definition of infrastructure, which she defines as the answer to the question of movement and relation. So she's talking about movement and relation as two things we typically understand as being kind of infrastructural, but then by saying it's the answer to the question of movement and relation, it really stages it as something which is, developed out of an institutional context. How do we solve this problem of movement and relation? Well, then there is an answer given, and that's an infrastructure. In the classical sense, it might be a kind of a toll road or public transport or etc. But I think this is now in the kind of, as we heard in the first session, where what the future looks like may be a screen and content on a screen, and our own relationship to material which goes onto that screen. We're talking about kind of affective infrastructures as well as physical infrastructures. So within modernist and postmodernist artistic critique, there's always been a kind of generalized resistance to Kant's idea of the aesthetic experience that sees the viewer as the site where art's political effects become visible. So most of the dissenters, like Royce, adopt some version of Nietzsche's critique that Kant, instead of envisaging the aesthetic problem from the point of view of the artist, creator, considered art and the beautiful purely from that of the spectator, leaving any disinterested definition of the beautiful leaving this disinterested definition of the beautiful in which, as Nietzsche says, a lack of any refined first-hand experience reposes in the shape of a fat worm of error. Great turn of phrase that he has there. So this sort of idea of the perspectival seeing and kind of doing that we expect from the artist is deprioritized in Kant's critical framework, where he attempts to understand a universalizable and sort of democratic freedom of the viewer who experiences the work. and that this is sort of culturally kind of conditioned, and the role of cultural institutions in developing the public up into being kind of good bourgeois citizens who can really kind of understand reflexively their role in culture. It has to be a sort of it can't be kind of completely stimulated. It has to be just sort of proposed, and then you as a viewer come to the work and become a better citizen because of it. So, some of you will know that kind of, debate between, Barnett Newman saying that, I've never met an ornithologist who thought that ornithology was for the birds, talking about aesthetics. This idea of a kind of complete sort of disjuncture between, again, what Gross is calling sort of sociological account and then the point of view of art as seen from the role of the artist. But when we're writing, and this gets turned over in the debates on new materialism, when one is writing or tweeting, one is never able to bypass these kinds of codes of language which we're using all the time to describe this sort of non-human. So I think Gross is rightly anxious to avoid the illustrative fallacy of political art, where it exhausts its ability to do aesthetic work precisely once it is a recognisable portrait of a political situation. So kind of Gross, saying, I agree, once you can kind of just formulate an immediate holistic picture of the work in your mind and understand what it's trying to do politically, it can no longer do that thing that moves you in any kind of political way. It just becomes an inert, non-equivalent object. The politics and aesthetic politics should be in the work's movement rather than its representation. Yet Gross seems to turn to a kind of sociological argument of his own in diagnosing today's participatory conditions, suggesting that because more people are interested in image production than contemplation, and he's talking here in 2010, before the development of Instagram, he says that this is why it's necessary to understand artistic production from the point of view of the producer. Because he says, quote, the technical and political decisions for which their subject can be made ethically and politically responsible is what's important to address in art's artificiality. Thus, Gross suggests poiesis or techne rather than aesthesis or hermeneutics is the mode which he's kind of looking for from criticism. But ironically, in making this move as well, Gross locates this problem of responsibility in the individualist frame of the producer. And I think that's a kind of limitation about sort of our understanding of kind of publics that I'm really trying to kind of unpick here. And it's got something to do with the kind of concept of kind of, I guess, artistic subjectivity as we understand it, as someone who is sort of latently expressive through their action for which they're responsible. That's what I'm trying to kind of pull apart. So, in the Northwestern Europe kind of legacy, like you're responsible because you do an act, and then that act will be judged by others, and you'll be held responsible or accountable through a trial for that act. So Gross acknowledges that the artistic persona is fundamental, but he doesn't materialise its production in a way that could see it as what I would call infrastructural. So I'm trying to, the proposition I have here is that by seeing artistic identities as infrastructure allows us to grapple with the sociological conditions, or sort of, the sociological conditions that underpin the production of artistic publics today, a problematic which Gross entirely misses by suggesting that a sociological critique has failed to understand the lessons of the avant-garde. I think that Gross and like many of his ilk, have failed to understand the lessons of feminist and anti-racist critique, particularly as they've been made within institutional critique. So we know today that the actions of avant-garde have relied on specific modes of universalised subjectivity that are impossible to dissociate now from the neoliberal ideal of the blank entrepreneurial self. So there's been enough discussion about how the kind of, the creative economy is in some way a kind of model for, for a broader kind of project of kind of neoliberal capitalism. So if the latent claims to authority which are still embedded in this mode is kind of what Laurent Ballant calls a kind of projectile sovereignty, that you're just sort of pushing your own sort of self out into the world all the time. It's actually this architecture that has to be made available for critique if the interventions made on behalf of the public are not to reinforce the axiomatics of imperialism that are all too familiar. So to take this a step further, if today the contemporary art world relies on the infrastructure of the artistic persona at the heart of capital-intensive production, any works which do not make available their grounding modes of subjectivity to critique will invariably participate in a kind of what I'm calling a privatization of practice, that I think sort of reinforces a kind of privatization of cultural infrastructure. It's a sort of a long homology, but saying by reserving the mode of kind of production of the artistic persona for oneself, one's enacting the same kind of operation that occurs in the kind of privatization of cultural infrastructure, where instead of being available for sort of democratic change, it's actually kind of held for sort of specific interests. So I think the problematics are here are best illustrated by the various analysis of Thomas Hirschhorn's Gramsci Monument, which I'm sure many of you will know, but I've just got a couple of pictures just in case we... So this is a project commissioned and produced by the Deer Art Foundation, located in Forest Houses of Southeast Bronx in 2013. It's one of Hirschhorn's ongoing attempts to create a universal artwork that escapes from terms such as identity and culture by locating a public work outside of traditional high visibility public spaces, which he feels are sort of over-determined and prevent this kind of non-exclusive audience that he's looking for from kind of coming into being. So, so as Julian Rose describes it, the Gramsci Monuments is the culmination of Hirschhorn's series of 4 homages to great thinkers. The evolution of these projects is an attempt to both to resurrect public space and also, I guess, the ideas that have defined it. The monument, the monument, whether hieratic statue or symbolic space. So the first such piece was the Spinoza Monument, 1999. It was cheekily located in the red light district of Amsterdam, constructed from cardboard, garbage bags, packing tape, but its primary element was a representational sculpture of Spinoza himself. Hirschhorn's interaction with the surrounding community was limited to borrowing electrical power from a nearby sex shop. The next year, we had the Deleuze Monument in a public housing development in Avignon in France, and it was built in cooperation with local residents. So this time we still had the figurative sculpture, an enormous cardboard bust of the philosopher, but then there was also this idea of the library, which would house kind of Deleuze-related material, and so this structure was vandalized soon after its completion. And then, as if in response, there was the Bataille Monument in Documenta 11, situated in the housing complex in Kassel, where Hirschhorn said he would not only build the project in collaboration with the community, but would also remain present for its duration. And there was still a major sculptural component, but there was this sort of misshapen organic form, and the accompanying spaces kind of multiplied. So for the Gramsci Monument, so for the Gramsci Monument, we'll leave Hirschhorn here because this is sort of the point. He is the point of all of his work, really. Hirschhorn sought to dispense with the residual monumental aspects of the Bataille Monument that he thought distracted from the total artwork. So, or this sort of ability to, engage all of the kind of project at once. As our Mergen notes, Hirschhorn has long inveighed against the reduction of art to any moniker, piece, show, or installation that might ossify its necessary and vital precariousness. So this is, I guess, this sort of avant-garde position that sees, proposes, movement as this kind of force against the sclerotic tendencies of culture that start to, once you sort of define something culturally, it just locks it down. In this kind of mode, I think the provisional, the temporary, the improvisational is seen as an expression of freedom or creativity to open up new models of action That's the avant-garde legacy, as I sort of understand it. And the public here is performative, being constructed anew at each moment, potentially evading all the structuring forces that constitute it. Implicitly, what's valorized here is the force and intensity of the artistic gesture that creates works that could stand up and become monumental, even more so by being anti-monumental. So the fact that kind of, Hirshhorn creates monuments out of something which is clearly not a monument only enables us to see his artistic kind of force in a less obscured kind of way, because that's what then the project kind of is. The artist takes these from site to site, demonstrating the possibility of new worlds in a paradigm of mobility and autonomy. This is sort of ironic in the case of the Gramsci monument, because Gramsci himself noted that intellectuals forge themselves as a stratum of administrators, scholars and scientists, theorists and non-ecclesiastical philosophers, etc., who come to think of themselves as, quote, an autonomous and independent of the dominant social group. But that's actually an illusion. Intellectuals are sort of, we are the, we're constructed by the dominant social groups, and we essentially do their handiwork even when we think that we are not. I've got a long sort of side rant that I could go on to about the appropriation of Gramsci in cultural studies, but we'll leave that for maybe drinks. So I think there's one kind of, so the aspect that I think becomes most interesting when listening to kind of, Hirshhorn talk about his own kind of sense of it is that he says I've always seen my mission as taking over responsibility for everything touching my work, but also responsibility for what I'm not responsible for. This is echoing kind of Groys's idea of the artist as someone who takes responsibility. But as kind of Gwen Ligon's analysis noted, Hirshhorn's taking of responsibility always leads us back to him, his artistic persona as a type of infrastructure, one which remains stubbornly unavailable to shifting in in relationship to the existing personas on the site. And that this led to an eventual distancing, inevitable distancing from, I guess, his concerns as from the kind of the personas that already existed in the community. Most of you know the sort of South Bronx as being predominantly black and kind of Latin American. Not the kind of place where the art world usually just kind of shows up. So this ultimate accountability to the art world and the implied artistic persona was a necessary kind of infrastructure. You could think of it like a toll road that allows the Dia Art Foundation to connect to a part of its city that it was not prepared to take directly. Not prepared to face directly. When Thomas Hirshhorn takes responsibility for his project in a way, rather than sharing it, I think he performs this kind of privatizing operation where he says, this project is my responsibility for the 3 months that it exists, and then after it's gone, he's very clear to say, this is not a social work project, I have no responsibility after that point. I'm taking this responsibility for here. And so, yeah, so I think this is kind of an important move that allows, the private capital that sort of flows through organisations like the Dia Art Foundation. If you know anything about their kind of funding structure, it comes from big oil money, but we have, it's Rupert Murdoch's son is on the board. We're talking about large sums of cash kind of flowing through here. This is what enables that to appropriate the Bronx's difference as an aesthetic problematic. So, to take another angle on responsibility, the work of Gertrude Spivak, who gave a talk at the monument, her work on responsibility emphasizes that the ability to answer to and answer for in being responsible is overdetermined by the institutional constraints that distribute responsibility in advance. So at the moment where one takes responsibility for authoring one's actions, one precisely fails to take responsibility for the fact that one can decide to take it. For Dia's purposes, and for Hirshhorn's, the actual events that took place under Hirshhorn's responsibility had little effect on the success or failure of how this work could be evaluated because of the institutions that, to which they were accountable, which was not the community. So Spivak here puts the issue of cultural says of the issue of cultural responsibility, the question of who should speak may be less important than who will listen. Or we could analogize the question of who will produce is less important than who will register these traces of production. So, like in a project like the Gramsci Monument, where, Hirshhorn's worked incredibly hard to employ all these kind of local people to actually be, undertaking kind of projects and talks and initiatives and trying to kind of, really democratically equalize the space for participation of everyone. But there's still this kind of, I guess, underlying kind of mode of responsibility taking that becomes the kind of barrier. Spivak says, well, the point is not who is actually talking at this event, but who is kind of listening to that event and how are they listening to this event. So the critique here, the possibility of critique here is not, taking responsibility, but opening fissures in the distribution of responsibilization. And so I could go more into kind of responsibility, but I would like to kind of, I'm going on a little bit long, so I'll just sort of skip ahead a little, but I think there's kind of more to kind of, you get this idea that, talking about a form of responsibility that's not about you taking it, but it's about it comes to you. Like from, when you're working in an environment, you sense something to which you feel responsible. And then you decide what to do from that. So if you try and, take that responsibility in advance, you actually close down the relationship with the other that would enable that. So I think, here we're talking about, it's a kind of a developmentalist paradigm, a kind of like, I think a kind of like white man's burden of kind of, of social aesthetics. The artist here is really a machinery which is always looking for a site of investment. And I think it's important with this project that Hirshhorn had a number of meetings with in different sites before receiving the invitation from one of the community members in South Bronx to come and do the project here. So in a way, this kind of project, as you can see within the history of the project, could have really happened anywhere, but it just happened here. So against the this kind of like an extractive mode of fly-in, fly-out aesthetic infrastructure, if we think today about public political movements like Occupy, we heard about earlier, BDS and resistance to the occupation of Palestine, or indigenous-led activism at Standing Rock, and North Dakota Access Pipeline, there's this one important mechanism for going public is through the refusal to be moved on. And so the use of networks here becomes not about sort of discovering new territories or kind of connection points, but is about, I guess, defending territories in some way. So against the settler colonial paradigm of movement, these protests speak to an ecological concern with infrastructure that exceeds the individual or the individual's responsibility. It's a desire for collective autonomy and ability to propose not just one's own answer to the question of movement relation, but actually a collective answer to that kind of problem. So I think it's kind of, starts to point us towards some of, we heard earlier about media ecologies, about this sort of more ecological kind of mode. So I think the most interesting account of the Gramsci Monument to me comes from Fred Moten, poet and critic. One must salt one's food to really taste the flavour. The bright flavour of this space was brought out by the monument, but that taste had always been there, which is to insist that the effervescence of the actually existing relationality of the forest houses and the promise of collectivity was and always is present in such spaces before their kind of activation in this kind of event. So I think to conceive of one's own work as a kind of seasoning brings us to kind of think about like a work as a kind of being supplementary to sort of social forces in some way. Salt production is almost global, it's kind of nearly ubiquitous, yet no one would want to sit down to a meal of salt, right? It's a kind of it has to go with something else, right? This is Gramsci's kind of whole point about political. It's got to be organically connected to the kind of, the body of work that it's doing. And so perhaps Moten's metaphor gives us a way to think about our own institutionalization in the salt mines of culture, also sometimes a low-value industry. What does a cooperative for salt production look like against the giant salt makers? I don't think it's going to be, the result of public-private partnerships such as our own desalination plant down the road here in Wonthaggi, which costs $230 million a year just to to the state government is to turn it on. You know, and I also just feel like the capital intensivity of a project like kind of Herschel and the Art Foundation's kind of mode suffers from some of these same kinds of challenges of neoliberal infrastructure. So I'll just, yeah, that should do it.